Good evening. Thanks again to all of you for joining us tonight to celebrate Mr. Lewis. We're very delighted to have you and grateful that you can share in this great evening. Before I get started, I want to mention that Tara Crutz was an executive with Wyndham Vacation Ownership and a member of our Executive Leadership Council. And unfortunately, just a few days ago, she passed away. And I would just ask if you all would join me in a moment of silence in her memory. Thank you. So Tisha had a disclaimer, and I have to offer one every year this time. I've got seasonal allergies, and when I talk about this man, sometimes they act up. And I'm not crying, and turn that camera off if my allergies act up tonight. After nearly 30 years of planning and attending charitable events, it can get hard to get excited, but I'm super excited tonight to honor our founder. It's really amazing to look around the room and see so many people who have played a key role in his life during these last 50 years. His wife, his children, his brother Ed, and I know I saw some other brothers. I didn't know they were going to be here, but they have to be his brothers. They all look alike. His Metropolitan Police Department colleagues, I believe Ms. Ernestine Johnson is here, who was one of his lieutenants, Mr. Winston Knight, and I believe Mr. Will Haynes is here. Some of his first staff at the fishing school that Tisha mentioned, Ms. Neal and Jackie Walls, his dear friends like Conrad Hipkins and Rick Bardash. A lot of our former board members came back for this occasion: Carl Patton, John Macklin, Evie Rooney, I think I saw in the room, and Julie Anderson came all the way from Chicago like she did every time we had board meetings. She'd fly in from Chicago. She's here tonight. Early financial supporters who were among the first to believe in Mr. Lewis and offer him grants, like Bitsy Folger, I believe, is here tonight. Allison Silberberg, who is now the mayor of Alexandria, but once wrote a book a few years ago that profiled Mr. Lewis. We're just glad all of you are here and thought enough of this great man to come back and share in this evening. About 10 or 11 years ago, the fishing school was facing the prospects of shutting down, and Terry Lineberger from our board mentioned just briefly a group called Charity Works. They're a group of volunteers that really saved the fishing school. They came together, as they did every year, and raised funds and invested at that time over $600,000 in the fishing school. Some of them are here tonight and still continuing to support us as a sponsor tonight. Terry Lineberger, Faye Marcette, and some of their friends. If you guys can just raise your hands. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for what you did 10 or 11 years ago. As a minister, Mr. Lewis founded the organization as a faith-based nonprofit, but for very valid reasons, 7 or 8 years ago, the board of directors changed our mission. And since that time, part of my job as the executive director is to make sure that the organization honors that mission. And as a man of faith myself, I quite honestly was a bit conflicted about that decision. But I think I've done a good job to keep us on track in that regard. But I do have to say to Jackie and the rest of the board tonight that I think I'm going to break some rules tonight, because I can't talk about this man without talking about his faith and without talking about my own. So hopefully I have a job on Monday, but that is what the occasion is tonight. The best way for me to describe the impact Mr. Lewis has had on my life is to share a little bit of the story that some of you may have heard before about how I met him and how I was hired as the executive director. At the time, a decade ago now, I was working as an executive with a prominent international nonprofit organization and was transitioning out of that role. And I was being recruited to be a vice president of a national civil rights organization led by an iconic social justice pioneer that I really was looking forward to working with. But then I made the mistake that a lot of people you've heard from tonight made. I met Tom Lewis, and the recruiter that was helping them find an executive director scheduled an interview with Tom and Sally Sullivan, who was the chair of the board of directors at the time. And they were honest. They told me in that meeting, they said, "We don't have the money to pay you what you make. In fact, we only have enough money to pay you for a year. And you need to know that just a couple of months ago, we were considering closing the doors of the fishing school." I don't know why, but I left that meeting excited. And I've thought about it a lot over the years. And I eventually called that other executive recruiter and told them that I was accepting another job, and I couldn't tell her what. She asked me, "What are you going to do?" And I just couldn't tell her, I'm not going to take the office now downtown K Street. I'm going to Wiley Street, and I'll be in a renovated crack house, and they may not be able to pay me. So I didn't have the heart to tell her that. I just told her I had a great opportunity, which is what it turned out to be. And so that day, I literally laid my dreams down and picked up Mr. Lewis's dreams and made them my own. As I said, I've thought for a long time over these last 10 years, why did I make that choice? And a lot of it had to do with what I felt that day when I met him, his integrity, his honesty, his character, his selflessness, his love for others, but most of all, his faith. All of that just emanated from him. You can just feel it in his presence. And he cared about the children, and he cared about working for and with marginalized people, which is what I dedicated my career to for the prior 20 years. And it excited me to be able to work only on doing the work and to get away from some of the big nonprofit corporate politics and everything else that goes on in these organizations. But he inspired me that day to make that decision to come to work for the fishing school. And then later I learned about other sacrifices he had made, how he worked for so many years without even taking a salary, worked full time. I heard stories from Mrs. Lewis about his battles with cancer and how he would literally leave chemotherapy and rush back to the office to make sure that he could meet the children there as they were coming from school. And so he'll be the first to tell you there's only been one perfect person to walk this earth. And he's not perfect, but he's certainly uncommon. And that was the inspiration that I felt that day, and I'm glad I did and decided to go to work with the fishing school. He told me two things when they hired me. The first thing he said is, "Leo, this is your job now, and as founder, I'm going to stay out of your way." And the second thing he said is, "I'll never do anything to hurt this fishing school." And he's kept his word every single day for the last decade, and we've never had a cross word. I've appreciated everything that he's done to make the path for us a little bit lighter. But there's one issue that we just couldn't resolve, and that is convincing Mr. Lewis to not preach at fishing school events. I think his pastor's here today, and so he, I'm sure, will recognize what I'm about to say. But for some reason, Terry Lineberger and I were given the responsibility of making sure that Mr. Lewis didn't spend too much time in the Bible when he spoke at the event that was coming up. And this was at the National Harbor. It had just opened not very long prior to that, and we had this great event planned. And so both Terry and I think, met with him separately over the phone and I think in person and, talked with him about his speech, and he told us he was good to go. And I checked in about 2 days before the event, and he must have known why I was calling because for the first time and the only time that I've known him, he was a little testy with me. I said, "Hello, Mr. Lewis, this is Leo." He said, "Hey." And usually when I call him with good news about the fishing school, every conversation we've had in person or over the phone, he'd find a way to say, "Well, bless the Lord, my friend." And so I figured I'd start in by giving him some good news. I said, "Mr. Lewis, the event at the National Harbor is sold out in a couple of days. We're going to have a great time." He said, "Okay, that's great." And I can tell that he wasn't feeling this whole conversation, so I was trying to think of how to get to the speech because that was my charge. I had to talk with him about it. And so I just did the only thing I could. I threw Terry under the bus, and I said, "Mr. Lewis, Terry wants to know how that speech is coming." And so he said, "Leo, I'm never going to do anything to hurt that fishing school." And he says, "As a matter of fact, I wrote that speech on some cards, and I'm going to make sure I stay on track in a couple of days, and we're ready to go." And so you fast forward a couple of days, we're at the National Harbor, standing room only crowd, and we're having a great time on an outdoor pavilion. And Mr. Lewis is doing his usual great speech, and there's not a dry eye in the room. And then all of a sudden I heard "Jesus." And I said, "Whoa, what's that?" And I thought, I'm in denial, so I'm thinking, okay, we've got Hispanic students now. Maybe he's talking about one of our students named Jesus, and he just, in haste, mispronounced the word. So he went on for a few minutes, and then all of a sudden I heard "Lazarus." And I thought, okay, now I know we're in trouble because I would remember if we have a student named Lazarus. And he then set those cards down. And to this day, maybe I'm overly sensitive, he set them down with a little bit of an attitude. And I think he was sending a message to Tara and I saying, don't you guys ever try to stop me from talking about my God. And he proceeded to talk about Lazarus and the tomb and how the stone was rolled away, and then he talked about how the fishing school was doing work in what were urban tombs and how we were rolling away stones of illiteracy and stones of hopelessness, and it was just the most powerful thing I'd ever heard. And again, it was not a dry eye in the room. And I know people who, theologians and others, say that the most powerful sermon was Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. But that day, we all got treated to Mr. Lewis's sermon at the harbor. And it was quite moving. And afterwards, he came up to me like he always does, and he said, Leo, my comments were good? I said, yeah, they were great. He said, because I'll never do anything to hurt that fishing school. And so I gave up after that point. I don't think I ever again tried to coach him on what to say. And as a matter of fact, I was at his home a few weeks ago, and I started praying before he even asked me to pray. And we just had a good time. And I refer to him, I think, now as just a modern-day version of Jeremiah, who was known as the preaching prophet and was famously known for saying that even if he tried to not talk about God, it'd be like fire shut up in his bones. And so I'm grateful. I met him that day 10 years ago. I'm grateful that he recommended me to the board. I'm grateful for his wisdom, his guidance, his support. But most of all, I'm grateful that I can call him my friend. And so every meeting, every conversation we had in person, every conversation we had over the phone, he'd always find a way to say these words. And so I'll close with saying to him, well, bless the Lord, my friend. We salute you.